morning, everybody. At least good morning from the West Coast, and I imagine to be a good afternoon in the East Coast of the US, and hopefully a good day for anybody else around the world who has joined us. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sebastián Sclofsky, and I am actually honored to have been asked by Kevin to moderate this conversation on his book. I met Kevin more than a decade ago when I was beginning my PhD at the University of Florida, and he was beginning his second year. It's been a long time since we have been in this academic adventure. And if there's something positive of it, is the friendships and the possibility of meeting really cool people along the way. So I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank Professor Omar Dahi for organizing this event. And I would like to introduce our two friends here who will be discussing Kevin's work. Let me introduce first Dr. Jessica Stites-Moore, Professor of History at the University of British Columbia. Professor Stites-Moore is an expert in South-South transnational activism and the relations between Latin America and other global South regions, particularly Middle East and Africa. Her latest book, published by the University of Wisconsin Press, is entitled South-South Solidarity and the Latin American Left. So welcome, Dr. Stites-Moore, and thank you for joining us. We also have here Dr. Alejandro Velasco, also an historian. It seems that we need historians to discuss Marx. And Dr. Velasco is an associate professor and associate dean for faculty and academic affairs at New York University. Dr. Velasco is an expert on modern Latin American history, culture and politics, democratization and social movement theory. His book, Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics and the Making of Modern Venezuela, was published by the University of California Press. So welcome, Dr. Velasco, and thank you for joining us. And before I give the stage to Dr. Kevin Funk, let me share a few brief thoughts about the importance of Kevin's book and this event. So Kevin's book comes at a crucial time in which neoliberal hegemony is being questioned more and more. And as Marx teaches us, the constant capitalist crisis opens spaces for political possibilities. The reaction by capital or some sectors of the capitalist class to this crisis in support for fascism and authoritarianism in the US, Brazil, and other places raises concerns and demands from those of us who are committed to social and material justice to be at least on alert. The massive protest we saw and see across the world, including the global South and the Middle East, the Arab Spring, the recent protest in Iran, are also a sign that there are always political possibilities. Kevin, following Marx explicitly and implicitly, shows us and asks from us to recognize how the capitalist system, full of contradictions, creates cracks among the capitalist class and opens possibilities for change. As Marx expressed, the laws of motion, and particularly the laws of competition, often posit individual capitalists against each other, fueling even more contradictions. Kevin complements this understanding in important ways, highlighting how elements beyond the narrow economic sense attempt to assuage the contradictions or fuel them even more. Kevin's book is an important contribution for a better understanding of Marx's ideas and breaks with this idea of a deterministic Marx, or the false dichotomy between base and superstructure. It forces us to understand how the different components of the system are interrelated and the possibilities that are open to engage in change. There is no such a thing as Marxism without agency. And one needs to read Capital's very long chapter on the working day to understand and observe that there's always room for change and action. So Kevin's book is an invitation, among other things, to actually read Marx, something that Kevin and I have shown it rarely happens, at least in top 10 political science graduate programs in the US. It is a challenge against the mischaracterization of Marx that often happen in academia, including in the so-called academic left in the US. And above all, it is a call for consciousness and action, not just interpretation. In this sense, this is a fantastic book, written by a good friend, who I am honored to introduce and ask him to share his thoughts with us. But once Kevin finishes sharing his thoughts, I'll ask Dr. Stites-Moore and then Dr. Velasco to share their thoughts. We'll go back to Kevin so he can respond, and then we'll open the discussion to the audience for comments and questions. So thank you very much for joining us. Kevin, please.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'll start by apologizing for my horrifically raspy voice, the product of a very ill-timed cold. So here we are. Thank you, Sebastián, for the very kind introduction, to Omar and the rest of the team at Security and Context for sponsoring and hosting the event, to the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia, my home program, for co-sponsoring, and to everyone else for being here. It's really a pleasure to share this space with you today and to be joined in conversation by Jessica, Alejandro, and Sebastián. And I really look forward to our dialogue and our exchange. Excuse me, I'll be doing that a lot probably. So to start, and before turning to your comments, I want to take a few minutes to read some general remarks about the project. So this book is based on extensive field work in Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and the United Arab Emirates, along with in-depth interviews with Arab Latin American business elites in these spaces. To contextualize, I started this project over a decade ago in what would become the twilight years of Latin America's, quote, left turn, a time of unprecedented diplomatic initiatives toward the Middle East by Lula, Hugo Chavez, and others, soon after most of the region's governments extended official recognition to Palestine, and in the midst of a boom period of record-breaking inter-regional trade. As I proceeded with the project, both regions fell into a series of crises. Inter-regional summits ceased, and a new generation of right-wing Latin American leaders abandoned the quest to build autonomous South-South relations. Situated within and trying to make sense of the shifting context, the book draws from these interviews, along with site visits and participant observation, to elucidate the construction of inter-regional ties and scrutinize the claim that global capitalists have developed a shared cosmopolitan class consciousness. For present purposes, then, I want to highlight three intended contributions. Excuse me. First, through ethnographic vignettes focusing on these elites, the book illustrates how they make global economic relations while navigating between their Arab ancestry, Latin American host cultures, and roles as protagonists of interregional relations. This is the interpretive moment invoked by the book's cover, which puts us in the place of a passenger, a Latin American one in this case, staring out the airplane window toward Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building, while preparing to land in Dubai for a business trip. By foregrounding their role in global capitalism's spread, I thus provide a corrective to conventional narratives that overlook or downplay the agency of global South actors, including elites, and highlight how South-South relations do not always function as a form of resistance against the global order. I show instead how these elites buttress global capitalism, while also reshaping it and extending its reach. And of note in this regard is the recent announcement that despite all of the political tumult of the past few years, last year's annual commercial flows between Brazil and the Arab world for the first time exceeded $30 billion, a 38% increase that resulted to a significant degree from increasing demand for Brazilian agricultural products, such as wheat and corn, due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In so doing, I draw from and add to a growing multilingual body of literature, including the output from the Latinist initiative, to which Jessica, Alejandro, Omar, and others contributed, that analyzes the many but oft overlooked historical and contemporary ties relating to trade, politics, culture, migration, food, and so on, that link these far away but long connected regions. I thus highlight the need to globalize our understanding of both Latin America and the Middle East. Second, by drawing from the admittedly somewhat esoteric Arab Latin American case, the book challenges and adds nuance to the commonsensical hegemonic notion that global capitalist elites are rootless and unmoored, exist independently of the state, and have shed national and other place-based identities and imaginaries in favor of a global class consciousness. As Manuel Castells famously put it, quote, elites are cosmopolitan, people are local. This basic notion is espoused by a rather motley crew, to put it mildly, of neoliberals, including intellectuals such as Hayek and Mises, liberal apologists like Thomas Friedman, Marxist-inspired scholars, social theorists, far-right politicians such as Marine Le Pen, Trump, Bannon, and others, and other sorts of nativists such as Samuel Huntington. I must say, in that regard, it was interesting and disconcerting to see that the term globalists, of course, became then a frequent buzzword and object of derision on the right during the period while I was writing this. For many in these latter categories, this term globalist, of course, carries anti-Semitic undertones, if not overtones. And there is a disquieting degree of overlap between these characterizations. And the famed Brazilian anthropologist Darcy Ribeiro's not uncommon observation in the classic text of Povo Brasileiro, the Brazilian people, that, and I'm quoting, the Arabs have been the most successful immigrants, quickly becoming integrated into Brazilian life and attaining positions in the government. They have even forgotten where they came from, and the miserable life in the countries of their origin. They're blind to the fact that their success can be explained to a large degree by the casual attitude they have in addressing and working with the local society. Armed with prejudices and incapable of any solidarity, detached from any loyalty in family or social obligations, and we might add the Brazilian nation. All of this allows them to concentrate their entire effort on getting rich, end quote. Yet the idea of elite globality in ideational terms has little empirical backing. As far as I'm aware, mine is the first in-depth analysis of global identity formation within a particular community of economic elites. Contrary to received wisdom, I argue that while globalization is strengthening border-crossing connections, it is simultaneously reinforcing certain localized cultural practices and imaginaries. Thus, I argue that global capitalism does not precisely obliterate particularistic identities. Rather, it is a culturally, racially, and ethnically inflected system that often relies on them. As I document, it is precisely those with the requisite cultural capital, primarily Latin American business elites of Arab descent, who are best situated to identify opportunities for, facilitate, participate in, and profit from economic exchange between the regions. And notably, beyond their own economic activities, Arab Latin American business entities also help to globalize Latin American capital by offering certificates of origin for exports, halal certificates, and worth noting is that Brazil is the world's largest exporter of halal meat, and networking, matchmaking, and educational workshops for their compatriots who wish to expand to Arab markets. The somewhat Orientalist and essentialist presumption behind such efforts is that only Arab Latin Americans possess and can teach other Latin Americans the necessary cultural frameworks for reaching economic and political agreements with other Arabs, as they are able, as John Tawfiq Karam put it, to quote, negotiate and barter the way only Arabs do. The title-rooted globalism thus speaks to the persistence as opposed to the death of national and other place-based imaginaries, even among assumed globalists. It captures how global identities are slowly rising, but without erasing existing national, ethnic, cultural, and racial attachments. In the process, generating mixed, palimpsest-like imaginaries and classed intersectional identities that are simultaneously local, national, transnational, and global. Third, and lastly, I argue that the common assertion that global capitalist elites are autonomous from the state or operate independently of space and place, whether material or ideationally, is not only misleading. It also poses a significant political problem. Indeed, arguments for a state-averse, free-floating, and globally minded capitalist class risk reinforcing, however unintentionally, two dangerous myths surrounding neoliberalism in particular, that its proponents, quote, hate the state, and that capitalist elites cannot be regulated. Instead, as Isaac Kamola aptly put it in his blurb for the book, and I appreciate that he put it much better than I did, I think, quote, capitalism is always cultural. Elites are rooted in places and states, and capitalism is far from coherently hegemonic. So my hope then with this book is really to contribute then to our ways of understanding actually existing global capitalism and neoliberalism, how they are made by actors on the ground in concrete circumstances, especially in Latin American and South-South contexts, by particularly situated elites whose agency and world-making efforts have received too little scrutiny or scholarly attention. With that, I will close, and I very much look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. And it's such a pleasure to meet you in person. I'm delighted to be invited. Thank you so much to Security and Context for having me today. And my first impression when I received the invitation was to take a peek at the title of the book and to immediately think, I don't know what this book is actually about yet until I had the chance to read it. The title suggests something that's very true about the book, that it's fast-paced, that it covers an enormous variety of question and topic, that its breathless approach to geography and time period creates this sense of energy and me especially kind of an enthusiasm for thinking further about these questions that I think that we're all talking about, those of us that are working on questions of internationalism, questions of what does globalization mean, what are the approaches to perspectives on the left and the right to neoliberalism from the global. And I think it was really useful as an historian to approach a work by a political scientist with such excellent guideposting. I'd like to commend you, Kevin, on wonderfully helpful introductory chapters, like having those guideposts, like telling us about where you find major figures like Huntington fitting into this big picture and into your critique was incredibly useful for orienting, both my own thoughts around what kind of contributions the book is making, but also understanding your critique of political science as a discipline and where you fit within that. I appreciated in particular the way that you took on questions of quantitative versus qualitative analysis and thinking about the way that these approaches sometimes overlook something that you do an excellent job of underlining, that of how relations and groupings sometimes defy neat numbers and ways of quantifying impact. And so, yeah, I thought that among the many things that this book contributes, especially for those of us outside of political science, is an excellent reading on what some of these debates are all about and what's at their core. And I'd like to kind of sort of think through how I imagine this book kind of operating in the larger conversation, both of Latin American Middle East relations, but also in our way of thinking about how transnational social movements work in general. And the first thing that comes to mind is this question around the new international economic order that you so carefully talk about, Kirkpatrick's approach, and the way that we have understood this to be both very true in many ways, but in the ordering of international institutions, of international banking and international trade, that there's very much like a there in terms of what that looks like on the ground, but also there are these competing imaginaries, these competing fantasies of what is possible and what's really happening within these spaces. Sort of you mentioned it, I think your term, which is wonderful, the borderless imaginary. And the thing that I think this book contributes that really helps us to flesh out a conversation is thinking about how corporate entities, corporate groups, and groups that find themselves attached to those groups, whether they be individuals or families or people who are business partners, how they fit into different envisionings of what it means to be operating within this economy, this international, this order. And so I imagine this book in conversation with a lot of work that's been happening, the earlier work, like touching on like the 1930s, 1940s, like Adam Getachu's book, World Making After Empire. I think of this as being very much in conversation with that, with Christy Thornton's work on Mexico's role in establishing, agency from the global South and determining sort of a developmentalist agenda in these international spaces. And I think you're providing us a powerful way of thinking about how some of these institutions operate with the great assistance of corporate entities and of individuals within those spheres, like shaping them. But I take the point quite well that you're making, that they don't agree and that they're not, it's very difficult. If we look at the literature on sociology of elites, there's an assumption that they do behave in more similar ways and in predictable ways. And that what your book and all of the lovely kind of detailed interviews that you present really seem to emphasize to me is that there isn't necessarily a consistent approach among these groups, that it's far more opportunistic and in many ways, and maybe part of your point is that their own attempts to come out ahead and be profit-seeking disable their ability to have a common unifying project. But I think it's a very worthy question to think about what one might be if we could start approaching that and taking this position of looking at elites who are of Arabic people's descent or from the Middle East, who are in Latin America, who have been part of a merchant class from early on and have moved into these high-profile multinational partnerships with the Middle East through increasing opportunity for trade. They present this space that's it's been fairly ignored in most of the literature of dialogue. And I think that's something that this book also kind of highlights, these resonances between both generations and different kinds of projects. For example, I really love when you talk about the Palestine Football Club in Chile and the conversations around that and the way in which different shapings of nationalism are sort of being echoed and not just mirrored, but also kind of brought in and out of representational strategies by these elites in order to kind of sell themselves to who they think they're talking to. I think that these vignettes, they illustrate a question that, for me at least, there's an ethical set of principles that's being invoked here. And the question that I have, how that changes over time, whether it's responding to national liberation struggles like that of the Palestinian people, or whether or not it's shifting and it's more about fairness and trade, like in a later period, that those kind of questions of how elites align themselves with narratives of ethical responsibility and how they mobilize that is a super important way to think about both, the perspective of understanding what they do and how they think, but also understanding how strategies of resistance might be more effective, which I think is a tremendous asset to those of us who study these kind of projects from the other end. And the other thing that I thought that this conversation sort of like brings to mind is a dialogue between your book and Paul Adler's work, No Globalization Without Representation, and sort of struggles that are kind of taking place through these big public debates. And that book covers more of a US perspective, thinking about how the Occupy Wall Street movement, the battle for Seattle, all these anti-capitalist movements are sort of setting an agenda for the state or pushing on an agenda for the state. And I think that this work helps us kind of understand the multiple bids that the state is sort of like being presented with from these different parties, and how anti-globalization is being framed, by multiple parties as an asset to the state, and how that then, creates pressure and also opportunity in different areas. So I think I'll just sort of conclude my comments by thanking you for this contribution, and I appreciate very much the scope that you've taken on, because I think it charts a course for a lot of new scholarship as well. Like any one of these individual pieces that you bring to light, and individual relationships between countries and groups, is food for many other questions and many other research projects to come. So thanks again for that. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica. And thank you, Kevin, for the invitation. And of course, Omar, Security and Context, for organizing, and Sebastián for moderating. Like Jessica just mentioned, one of the things that's really quite fascinating about the book is how it invites new questions and really charts a path for a research agenda moving forward. And to some extent, that's the highest compliment that one can pay to a book, right? That it opens up new questions. And I want to highlight what some of those are for me. But before, I think one of the purposes of these kinds of events is really to encourage and to excite other people to actually read the book, because as also Jessica mentioned, it is so rich, so expansive, really amazingly ambitious in ways that I'm going to try to elucidate a little bit. But before I do that, I wanted to start with a bit of a vignette. I hope that you'll indulge me for a second, about the first time that I traveled to Palestine in 2016. Much like Kevin was mentioning, this is actually slightly at the tail end of the apogee of the pink tide in Latin America. So some of the cracks that Kevin alluded to at the beginning were already beginning to be manifest. But so I was in Ramallah just talking with people about this Latinese project that was alluded to earlier. And one of the things that everyone kept saying is like, oh wait, there's so many Chileans that come here, or who send their children to come here, like for 2 or 3 weeks, just to reacquaint themselves with the land of origin. And I said, oh, that's fascinating. I had no idea. I know a little bit about the Palestinos and the football team in Chile, as Kevin recounts, but to see this in practice is really fascinating. So of course I was asking more questions. And they are the most conservative actors in Palestine today, because really primarily what they want is a kind of economic stability, and they don't really get any of the sense of the political allegiances and ideologies that are at play in the region. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's something there. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the border wall, of course, in Israel, one of the really fascinating components of what I learned there was, to the extent that there is any kind of left in Israeli politics, it is overrepresented by descendant or migrants from Argentina who traveled there in the late 70s and 80s, early 80s, escaping the dictatorship, which was targeting Jews. And of course, they went to an Israel in a context that they imagined was, kind of socialist haven, whatever, just at the time that Israeli politics were veering dramatically to the right. And so this was completely, challenging every notion that I had about how politics works transnationally in the context of these, bilateral relations. And really, in reading Kevin's book, what I thought was like, wow, would have been amazing to have this book back in 2016 to help me make sense of some of these unexpected patterns of not only migratory flows, but what that translates to in terms of political economies, politics in general, and horizons of possibility. So thank you for writing this book, Kevin. I wish I'd had it about 10 years ago, but no one's perfect. So thank you so much. But that actually opens up, because what I wanted to do really was to lay out what I think are some of the major contributions that you make in a variety of areas, beyond, as Jessica's already mentioned, the kind of mapping, both geographical but also theoretical, that you do within the realm of political science to really explode certainly my kind of prejudices about the field. In fact, there were many moments when I forgot that this was a book written by political scientists, which is, let's just say, a compliment. On the other hand, what is really quite amazing, and I alluded to this before, is just the range of ambition of the book in so many different planes. And because it is so expansive and ambitious, I just want to lay it out for folks to get a sense of what that actually means. Certainly in terms of the theoretical interventions that you're making, it is and you lay those out so beautifully and expansively in chapter 1. It leaves one with a very clear sense of why it matters to be looking at these Latin American Arab elites in the way that you do. We don't have to recount the whole thing, right? But to the extent that, going from the 1980s and extending into the 90s and early 2000s, a plethora of terms like intermestic to try to describe this dynamic of simultaneously global and or international and domestic, emerging from fields like political science, international relations. Then, of course, as you allude to in the context of sociology, the phenomenon of the glocal, right, as a way to describe not just political economic ties or national relations, but also more cultural, social ties that link up peoples at the level of the global and at the local at the same time. Of course, it's a term that then gets taken up, and to some extent, Jessica does this in her work, among social movements, right, to sort of theorize connections that were otherwise not available, not seemingly available in prior contexts. And then, of course, with the rise of neoliberalism and its hegemony in the 1990s, kind of bastard and, as you say, banal versions of these more sophisticated understandings of the interplay between these two realms by people like Friedman, and the whole notion of the Earth being flat, and the effacing of difference in favor of a kind of common identity or collective identity, which of course was always just a kind of fiction for kind of much more complicated political and economic project. But on the flip side, as you also articulate in this, again, extremely expansive kind of theoretical range, the work of people like Michael Hart and Tony Negri in the series about empire and multitude, and how this notion of, in the context of an expanding, internet and ability to connect in ways that previously were unavailable, how that was also creating both fractures and cracks, as Jessica alluded to, in the context of global empire, but at the same time also opportunities for multitude to seep in, right? So partly, that you're engaging with all of these and also pointing out the fundamental limit to some extent of all of them, because what you highlight is that what most of these miss or take for granted is that they develop in a context where the dialogue or the flow of dialogue is really global north to global south, or perhaps sometimes global south to global north. But the fundamental question that you ask is, well, what happens if we not so much ally the global north, but think about it as sort of much more horizontal between agents of the global south, right? That fundamentally shifts how one asks the question about the interplay of what we understand by global and then what we understand by local. And unsurprisingly, what emerges, of course, is a much more, as Jessica mentioned, complicated story of elites that, share some allegiances, but not others, that have a kind of shared class identity, but not in all contexts, right? And fundamentally, as the title alludes to, is rooted, right, in a powerful sense of national identity, but also at the same time always looking outside, right? So that there's no there's no dismissal of the local. In fact, it's completely tied to one's identity as part of a larger global elite. So, this points to the theoretical possibilities and really the necessity of thinking beyond the axis of north to south, and in fact, really thinking about it more in terms of south-south or other types of relations. But so that theoretical contribution, especially laid out in chapter 1, is just really quite compelling and rich. And then, of course, thematically, one of the amazing contributions that you make in chapter 2 in particular is understanding that we can't parse this complex web of the rooted globalists or rooted globalism without delving very deeply into the histories that give them rise, right? And so, I train political, no, I do not train politicals. I train historians, for a living, and one of the hardest things to do, and I'm so glad that Jessica alluded to Christy Thornton's book, because it does this really well. One of the most difficult things to do really is to have a comprehensive range of histories that intersect beyond the nation state. I mean, historians, I think, are we're notoriously bad at, thinking, regionally, and we, much better at thinking, nationally or subnationally. And so to see, as you do in chapter 2, just this tremendous historical analysis of migratory flows to Chile, to Argentina, to Brazil, which are your countries of focus, but then also thinking about how they fit into this larger regional picture, grounds the argument in a way that otherwise wouldn't have been possible, right? So this conversation that is constantly existing between the histories of these places and the people that then comprise it, and then how they look outside of it is really quite compelling thematically, which then opens up the range for the kind of methodological interventions that the book makes. And of course, these are mostly captured in chapters 3 and 4, as you already mentioned, with the rich set of deep ethnographic readings and close readings of interviews that you've done with elites. And of course, this is fascinating because, as you well say throughout, there is this preoccupation, or certainly a kind of an overwhelming preoccupation, especially on the part of US academics and in sociology to some extent, and of course history and anthropology, with and you cite the joke about the 5 Eskimos in an igloo, and then of course how that translates into the favelas of Rio, where it's really this preoccupation with subalterns. What it misses and obscures is deep attention to elites, which again sort of seems like it should be taken for granted as a problem, but it's not, right? And so it's so refreshing, but also instructive to see how you actually go about and narrate the process of interviewing these elites. I can't even imagine trying to do so in a way that would elicit the kind of information and analysis that you've done so here so richly and beautifully. And so that, that kind of methodological intervention is extremely useful for, for disrupting understandings of who should we look at when we're really thinking about the broad range of actors that comprise political economy. And so, of course, that also opens up another methodological intervention, which you end with in chapter 5, which, brings in and introduces a kind of media studies and even performance studies dimension to the analysis. And you make this really bold claim when you're looking at, propaganda campaigns and ad campaigns that we've all seen every time we get into an airplane and we walk down the ramp, and you got the HSBC or HBSC, whatever the name of the bank is, like, you're always simultaneously away and here, right? And this kind of mix that you see constantly. What you lay bare is that it's a fiction, maybe not a fiction, but it is aspirational. And really what it's doing is creating the possibility of something that we otherwise, as we're walking down that ramp, assume to already be true. And because you're delving into it so deeply, especially with these ethnographic renderings, you find actually that it is aspirational, not just factual. And so like this corporate, as you say, corporate discourses promoting globality amount to political performance by capitalist entities to promote their own material profit-seeking interest, right? And so seeing it in those terms really helped me politically to understand what is at stake, and therefore what, as Sebastián was alluding to before, are the opportunities of contesting this in terms of governance, in terms of accountability. So that's all to say that, in its method and in its content, the book really mirrors in important ways the core argument, which is that, as you say towards the introduction, place-based motivating imaginaries continue to reverberate more frequently than their place-less counterparts among capitalist elites, right? That the primacy of place, which again, literatures about the rise of globalism, globalization, et cetera, really seem to leave to the side, are so powerful when brought to the surface, and not just at the level of empirical reality, but also political imaginaries. And so that is so well mirrored in the method and sort of the content of the book, such that, as you say, like border crossing, even though you do a lot of border crossing methodologically and theoretically in the book, does not mean identity crossing all the time. And to see that played out is really quite fascinating. And ultimately, what's odd and kind of interesting as you finish the book is that once you're done, it sort of all makes intuitive sense. Like, of course, why would we ever have imagined that, global elites, especially in the South, imagine themselves detached or divorced from place? The reason why it's important to be rooted in place, as you lay out, is because their political ambitions domestically are tied to their power globally, right? And so it's not a rejection or a kind of fetish of the outside. It's the outside purposely and utilitarianly used in order to amass political power domestically. And so once it's laid out as you do, so clearly, it becomes not only a kind of North Star, I guess that's a bad metaphor, but it kind of becomes like a guiding sort of principle to understand what is really necessary to be able to analyze this political moment, rather than just take for granted a kind of easy global circulation of elites that create a very sort of tight class identity. And so in that sense, I mean, one of the things that I was thinking is that it really echoes, kind of early work by Albert Hirschman, right? So when he talks about the political economy of import substitutional industrialization in the 50s and 60s, one of the key actors that he pays attention to are political elites in these countries who understand that their power, eventual power, and modernizing states are tied to an ISI project. And it's not, they don't see this as a threat. In fact, it's quite the way that political elites will come to a different kind of power in the context of modernization. And so one of the questions that I had really was, to what extent do you see this as a kind of continuation of those patterns, rather than something that emerges in a moment of expanding global ties, especially in the 80s and 90s. And therefore, to what extent, theoretically and empirically, you see this, tied to, the work of people like Hirschman earlier. And so, in that sense, I think what's the other part that's really quite useful to think about, and I mentioned it to a couple of times that I want to highlight it, is that ultimately what the book is, beyond all the interventions and contributions that it makes, and Sebastián alluded to this before, it is a deeply political book, right? It's a book that has a clear purpose in mind, and the purpose in mind is to better render the dynamics of political power in societies such as the ones you describe, in order to be able to have a better diagnosis for shaping political opportunities and horizons, right? So this isn't, let's just put it this way, it's not a book for a book's sake. It's a book because it has an actual political purchase to it. And so to that extent, it's really powerful to read. I'll end with just a couple of comments that in terms of the agendas that I think that your book really opens up, some of which, are, I think, quite predictable, but also I think really worth, and you bring some of those up at the end, but it's really worth to parse and sit with for a little bit. do you imagine, or for other research or future research, that the patterns that you lay out here, are they similar in other parts of Latin America than the ones that you consider, right? Because you focus primarily on Chile, Argentina, and Brazil. But, think about Carlos Slim, and you make a brief reference to Slim or his sort of Lebanese ancestry. Is Mexican dynamics similar than the ones that you think about in the Southern Cone? It would be interesting to see if there are any, what kind of differences or similarities emerge, especially with much closer proximity to the United States in that context. But and you also referenced Nayib Bukele. Obviously, you couldn't quite parse it as much as you might have wanted to or needed to. But Central America, of course, is also a place where, Arab-descendant peoples have had a primary place of political power over the last 100 years. So does that affect things? And the case of Bukele, I think, really opens up a question as to, does this seem to be a replicable pattern elsewhere? The other big question that it lays for me, and this is why the Latinese project really sort of got started, was to think about the reverse flow of migrations of patterns, right? And so to what extent does this, to what extent can we imagine this playing out back in the Middle East? You talked about the travel that you did and the research that you did in the UAE, but how do people who come back from Latin America and settle or have settled in the Middle East, what are their relations? What is their imaginaries about Latin America, and how does that shape the bilateral relation, right? And it doesn't have to be just in the context of economics, as you mentioned, culture, politics, etc. But thinking about those reverse flows, I wonder how they complicate the picture or how they render it more seamless. So that's what I had. Thank you so much again for the opportunity to read and engage with the book. It's really fantastic, and I hope that others read it as well.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for your comments. I'll take a few minutes to speak to some of the themes that were invoked. And again, I really appreciate the care and the attention that you devoted to thinking about these issues, and for all of the food for thought that you've given to me as well. It's interesting, Alejandro, that your kind of initial vignette was on the Palestinian side, whereas in a sense mine was on the Chilean side of arriving to Chile and kind of unexpectedly being confronted with this reality of particular kinds of last names and people wearing keffiyehs and the arrival of Palestinian refugees and so forth. That was my initial foray into this, in a sense. Again, to kind of speak to some themes that were raised commonly. It is certainly an expansive book in various ways. Eclectic is a word I feel like I've kind of used as a euphemism, perhaps, for the rather broad range that I sought to cover. There were certainly moments along the way where it felt like I was tackling a series of questions that were beyond my individual capacity to address, certainly. And so, I think the book represents a kind of a struggle with a very challenging set of questions that tries to, in a very micro way, say something about a much larger issue, which to go back to what you were saying, Alejandro, about kind of applying this to other contexts, right? I mean, I do think there is something that strikes me that is kind of universal about this story, I suspect, without having done field work, in Central America, among Arab-descendant populations there, or in South America, in these countries, with people from other diasporic communities, where you have similar kinds of relations percolating. Part of the intervention I want to make is that this is a story about a particular case, but it happens, of course, all of the time in quote unquote global North social science, where there's comfort with drawing from individual cases in order to elucidate broader dynamics. I don't want to recreate that sort of dynamic where I'm kind of homogenizing based on a very esoteric case, as I said. But nonetheless, I do think there's value in, from a different starting point, a kind of South-South starting point, using this as a stepping stone for thinking about these broader issues surrounding global imaginaries and class consciousness and so forth. As you know, I appreciate the opportunity to hear from historians, certainly, and definitely tried to kind of contextualize the broader framework in which these relations unfold in a contemporary sense. And as I think all of you noted in different ways, right? I mean, this, I am a political scientist by training, but a rather unconventional one in certain ways, and certainly I'm one who does not feel kind of confined to disciplinary boundaries, or boundaries in terms of kind of what I'm reading or feeling inspired by. And I did just want to mention kind of what, why maybe that matters in particular ways for the book and the way it unfolds. So, one of them being that, the kind of very question of how to write about the interviews immediately became very fraught for me, because I carried out a series of interviews that was very ethnographic in nature, as mentioned. And then I remember sitting down to write them, and I immediately, not because anybody literally told me to do this, but socialization processes being what they are, I immediately started writing them in a very formulaic, kind of end quote, he said this, and then on to the next thing. And it felt like cherry picking. And so I started doing that and chucked it away after not very long, and just decided this felt unsatisfying to me. And disciplinary norms within political science aside, I was going to proceed in the way that I thought made sense vis-a-vis the kind of overall methodological approach of the book. There was kind of a mention then about sort of a lack of focus within, say, political science in particular on elites. And I have this quote which I just wanted to mention, which is I give here at the beginning of the conclusion. And so I'm quoting this very kind of mainstream article about democratic politics, or by a few specialists in democratic politics. And as they write, and this is, again, kind of like a prominent mainstream political science journal, it is striking how little political scientists actually know about the political attitudes and behavior of wealthy citizens. And that just strikes me as an incredible problem. And, also a very striking problem, right? Insofar as political science posits itself as being a discipline that centers around interrogating power relations, the fact that there is this massive kind of lacuna about actually studying the behavior and attitudes of elites is incredibly striking, quite frankly. As I further mentioned then, right, with this kind of related issue in a sense of, a kind of US centrism, what tends to then get produced about Latin America also does not often engage with elite related questions. And so, in that sense, I'm trying to kind of thread different needles simultaneously, but, without then kind of reinforcing any of the sorts of stereotypical notions that I'm also contesting with this analysis. As Jessica said, and I appreciate you kind of mentioning some of these other works, Christy Thornton and Adam Getachew came up as well. And I was thinking about Margarita Fajardo's recent book, The World That Latin America Created. It does strike me that especially out of the discipline of history, there's been a lot of very important work done recently, or within kind of like historically inflected political science work, trying to get at these broader questions of world order formation and its contemporary implications, and looking at different kinds of quote unquote non-global north sorts of perspectives. And I'm, very, very happy, and it would be an honor to feel like I'm contributing to those sorts of conversations. One of the things that I was sort of forced to reckon with that goes to some of the concerns that you and that Alejandro and Jessica, you both mentioned, is this kind of shifting context, right? And so, when I start writing this, it's very easy to read these economic relations as being part of this regional quest for autonomy, driven by Lula and others, is building this kind of like alternative South-South regional space. I have this quote by Celso Amorim in here, the former foreign minister and defense minister, and who says, well, we're building these sorts of relations so that to get from, I forget the exact places he used, but something like, to get from Brazil to Cairo, you don't need to change planes in Paris anymore, essentially. And so, what you see then essentially is, there is a time where, again, it's very easy to like map those relations onto a sort of South-South developmentalist kind of agenda. What happens when the Brazilian PT experiment falls apart and is deconstructed, and Bolsonaro comes to power and so forth, right? Is that in turn, the political initiatives fall away, but the economic relations continue to a very large extent. So, what we see now, as I mentioned, right, is the fact that, with all of the trials and tribulations of recent years, it's now the case that, the economic relations are larger than they've ever been. And that in part has to do with, particulars relating to inflation and the war in Ukraine and its implications. But, it also is just it's a relic of the economic side of this time period. And so one way of reading the analysis is it's kind of a rejoinder to the tendency to have looked at the economic side of this agenda during the left turn years as being driven by a, say, developmentalist agenda, and not taking into account the extent to which there was a business elite which was kind of playing a role in driving that agenda as well, or at least attaching itself to that agenda. And so now we see that agenda kind of living on without the political side. Just to add one more thing quickly, I then try to engage in a story that's very nuanced in lots of different ways. And, there was a sort of a reference here to thinking about, kind of my own positionality then, and sort of what it was like to do these interviews. And so, I kind of wanted to go beyond a sort of caricatured version too of what it meant to engage in this sort of elite Latin American space, and use my own forms of privilege as a white male from the US to have a sort of conversation that would allow me to access parts of their worldview that I would not have easily been accessed otherwise, and to try to shed some light again from that own particular positionality concerning how these people who are exercising lots of agency are constructing their own realities and engaging in these kinds of world-making efforts.
Thank you very much, guys. I'm gonna check. So I'm gonna read it. We have a question from the audience, from Silvia Faraboli from Brazil. So the question asks, why we don't see politicians such as Geraldo Alckmin, Fernando Haddad, and Simone Tebet mobilizing their Arab identities during the elections. So why do you think this happened? So that's one question. And the second question is, how is it possible that the highest posts of the Brazilian politics have been in the hands of Arab descendants such as Michel Temer, Fernando Haddad, and Paulo Maluf, which does not happen with other important groups of immigrants such as the Japanese?
Very, very profound questions. Thank you, Sylvia, for posing them. I almost feel like she may be better situated to answer them than I am, in fact, and I'd be interested to hear her thoughts, certainly. In fact, I don't know that I was aware that Geraldo Alckmin was of Lebanese ancestry until I think it might have been Sylvia, actually, who mentioned it to me. In turn, just looking at the second part of the question now as well. I think what this speaks to, without being able to really answer either of these questions, is again the kind of the sort of research agenda that exists out there, and the many interesting questions that remain to be to be critically interrogated, right? And so, Alejandro mentioned this question of thinking about people who've returned from the Middle East, or from Arab descendant migrants or descendants of migrants who've then gone back to the Middle East. I have this brief reference in the book to the fact that mate, as our moderator is drinking now, has become popular in certain places in Syria because of this reverse migratory flow. There's a recent Portuguese language book called Primos, which talks about some of these dynamics and actually involves some kind of on the ground reporting, talks about these like small villages in Lebanon where Portuguese is almost a lingua franca, which is a really interesting kind of transnational space to think about. And again, it just strikes me that there is a lot of very interesting work to be done on this. And so just to then circle back quickly to Sylvia's questions, I'm really not sure, quite frankly. I do think that Arab identity, has been used and understood in particular kinds of ways in different Latin American contexts. I mentioned that Darcy Ribeiro quote, which certainly speaks to certain kinds of commonsensical understandings. Paulo Maluffi's mentioned here, and we can't mention him without thinking about that sort of classic kind of phrase of that he steals but he gets things done. And so on the one hand, I think it'd be very interesting to kind of think about these populations in kind of in a comparative context, but while also being very aware that there is like a distinct history to the arrival of Arab peoples to the region, and the way that they get kind of understood within these respective societies, and kind of the sorts of imaginaries and stereotypes that percolate about them.
I have a follow-up question, Kevin. So you were mentioning about the issue of your positionality and how, in the context of doing these interviews, you're both cognizant of it, but then that also helped to elicit kinds of responses that may otherwise have been more difficult to arrive at. So do you know if some of your respondents have read the book yet? And if so, how have they responded to it? Were the kinds of ideas and arguments that you eventually came to present in the book also something that you had already discussed with the respondents? I'm just really curious to see, what kinds of reactions you encountered.
Yeah, and if I can just pile on an extra one here, I'm very curious too. I think one of the most interesting parts of this book to me is the way that you're trying to help us understand how irreducible class consciousness and like political subjecthood formation is. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit further about, if you could propose a model, what would that look like for this particular group under study?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the second part of the question?
Oh, just, I think what you're doing is you're offering us an opening to start thinking about how political subjectivities get crafted, in particular among elites. And I'd love it if you could sort of throw out what you're coming to in terms of how you would model our approach to thinking about consciousness formation.
Yes, so thank you so much for those follow-ups. Yeah, I mean, the positionality question, I think it's very important to this analysis, of course, and interesting. I mean, I went into this rather naively in certain ways, without, quite knowing what I was getting into and what was the nature of the waters that I would be navigating. And, it did quickly become clear to me that, this was a particular kind of elite space that, quite frankly, it took me a significant amount of effort to break into. And so, I made a lot of kind of futile efforts at contact before kind of having a breakthrough moment that allowed me then to kind of, through snowball sampling, so to speak, start to reach others. Something that kind of came to the fore to me as I was proceeding with the analysis as I was kind of proceeding with reaching out to people and then having conversations and being in touch with them subsequently to an extent, was, in general, I found that they actually weren't necessarily that interested in what I was doing, and granted me a level of access that I found to be surprising. I kind of entering these spaces without kind of personal connections at the start. What I ended up finding was that, in a lot of cases, they were actually very interested in talking about themselves. And, I think that maybe it's a sort of unsurprising conclusion in a way, but, it speaks to something very human, that, in this place in the positionality question, in a sense of, somebody coming from afar who's then demonstrating interest in their activities, and carries certain kinds of privilege. And so I found quite conventionally a real sort of readiness to share about what they were doing, and also gained a kind of window into their life worlds that I wasn't necessarily expecting. And I'll point out in that regard, there were things that emerged out of those moments that I then didn't feel comfortable putting into the book. Particular things that were said, and particular things that were especially sort of defamatory potentially, for example, which speaks to that kind of to the extent to which I was able to gain a certain level of access. I haven't stayed in consistent contact with many of the people on the kind of business side of things. That speaks to a number of phenomena, and I think one of them being is that many of them are just very busy, and I was able to fortunately kind of peel off a little bit of their time once or twice, and I don't get the sense that many of them kind of thought much about beyond the conversation we had, sort of what it all meant, beyond one of the interlocutors who I mentioned at the end of the second vignette chapter, who I haven't been in touch with either, but who was like actually very kind of self-reflective. I was very much interested in me and my own analysis. But it would certainly be interesting to kind of know more about the reception question in that way. In terms of the second question, just very briefly, regarding consciousness formation, I really wrestled a lot with thinking about how to define terms here, and tried to spell it out as clearly as I could, even by using bullet points in one area of like we're just seeing all these things being thrown out in terms of a national, a transnational, a global, and get these sentences, and I reproduce some of them of like there's a transnational capitalist class that forms a new global elite, and it really confused me much of the time. And so, part of the project then was to really try to delineate how we might analytically separate those sorts of terms. As I was doing so, I think in a sense, if you like look at a sort of straightforward understanding of what it would mean to think of a global consciousness, that's a rather high bar, certainly. And so, I think that then pushes us to go back to that question Alejandro was mentioning of like, so why is that being asserted, right? I mean, if we really take that question of globality, certainly at the level of identity and imaginaries, and like really thinking in sorts of global terms, in terms of, in the sense of kind of belonging and a positive set of attachments to peers and other sorts of places, that is a high bar, right? Which again kind of raises that question of like, so why is this being stated all of the time, right? And is the word global then doing a lot of work analytically that is also very political, but then has a lot of meaning embedded within it that may not necessarily be intended in the way that the term is actually kind of operationalizes.
We're over the hour, and we should be closing, but let me take the privilege of asking one final question, which, let me ask you a question, the question, Kevin, that we used to generally ask when we were together in panels, which is the political question. As a political organizer and political activist that has got this book and start reading it or finish reading it, what would you suggest would be the I wouldn't say the usefulness would be the word, but how would like to this book to inspire those who are actually organizing and becoming politically active?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And Alejandro pointed to this as well in mentioning that it's a very political book. I'll note in that regard that I was in fact specifically pushed to think in those terms by the mythical reviewer too. You know, I mean, like very specifically pushed me kind of, you know, given the sort of ideological frameworks in which I was operating, that the political question needs to be directly addressed. It wasn't something I had directly addressed, you know, beyond, I suppose, the sort of usual comments in the conclusion. And so, you know, that was useful for me to then explicitly try to situate what is relevant about this in a broader sense. And, you know, there are a number of things to point to in that regard. You know, one of them being this question of how we think about the Global South and how we think about Global South agency, and how we see, you know, the Global South and Global South agency intersecting with other kinds of axes, such as social class. And so I mean, I'm very much interested in that question, kind of going forward in my research of interrogating and critically interrogating the nature of the Global South elite and its role in the world. And, you know, the ways in which that is both kind of similar to and different from, you know, sort of like standardized account of how a global North elite behaves. And, you know, secondly, I would point to, you know, this notion of how, again, the term global is being used, and this invocation of the global imaginary. You know, as Alejandro mentioned, I was also struck by, you know, walking down jet bridges and seeing these kind of very visceral invocations of the global, and, you know, thinking about that as being a sort of aspirational space that is tied to a particular kind of emotional logic that is capitalist, but also not, or at least can potentially be capitalist, or can be used in a capitalist kind of way. And so, you know, part of what I want to do then with this book is push us to think about the politics of global imaginaries, as the title suggests, but then not find ourselves in a moment where the response becomes sort of retreating to a kind of defensive nationalism against a particular kind of corporate use of a global imaginary. And so, you know, this is what I try to tease out toward the end of the book then, of, you know, the need to kind of chart a third path in that way, beyond what, you know, would have felt, you know, certainly felt like at certain points in the past few years, you know, on the one hand, a kind of like corporate friendly globalism, and then a right-wing nationalism with certain parts of the left kind of chasing the right wing in that way. You know, trying to then chart out what it would mean to reject a particular kind of global imaginary, but without rejecting global imaginaries in general. And, you know, thinking about how a global imaginary could be thought of differently. And so, you know, to the extent the book makes any sort of political difference, you know, I would be happy if it came at that level.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you very much, Professor Omar Dahi and Security in Context, for organizing this. Thank you very much, Kevin, for inviting me. And thank you very much to Dr. Jessica Stites Moore and Dr. Alejandro Velasco for this wonderful conversation. And let me restate what I said at the beginning. If there's something positive about this academic adventure, is the possibility of finding cool people along the way. So thank you very much. Hope to meet you guys in person, although we are in fields very much afar, but, you know, these topics bring us together. So thank you very much again. And to all in the audience, there are a couple of comments there. Thank you, Ileana. Thank you, Mariana, for your comments, for your kind comments. And to all the people in the audience, thank you for joining us. Buy the book, read it, send comments to Kevin. If he doesn't answer, email me and I'll ask him to answer. Again, thank you very much. Have a great day. Enjoy, guys.